Hello, and welcome to Everything is Spooky in the Dark, the podcast for WanderingCrystal.com. I'm your host, Crystal, and today we will be talking about the above-ground Oven Crypts in New Orleans. New Orleans is a place where life and death exist side by side. The two coexist in a sort of macabre dance that feels like the bright, lively celebrations of the city fits perfectly alongside the morbid and grisly stories that plague the history of New Orleans. The city is abundant with spooky attractions that lure people in from around the world each year. From ghost tours to vampire folklore to venturing into the world of voodoo, everyone seems to enjoy the everlasting ominous atmosphere that lingers in the air. One of the main tourist attractions in New Orleans is visiting the historic cemeteries. Passing through the city, you'll notice that in New Orleans, the cemeteries are much different than most other areas around the country. The city is rampant with above-ground tombs, rather than the in-ground burials that are common in other places. When I visited New Orleans St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 in early May, the air within the cemetery was thick from the intense heat that was beaming down from the sun. The above-ground tombs held in the scorching heat, creating an incredibly uncomfortable environment. Due to the swampy land, it was difficult to keep coffins underneath the ground. When the bodies inside the caskets would decompose, the coffin would fill with air and gases, causing the casket to rise and pop up out of the ground. Not only was this gruesome, but due to a lot of the population dying from yellow fever, it created a health hazard to the living. The people of New Orleans did try to combat this by drilling holes into the coffins to let the air escape, while also weighing down the rest of the coffin with rocks and sand. Now, this worked for a while, but ultimately the bodies had difficulty decomposing properly because due to the city's high water table, the corpses were always submerged in water. Underground burial spaces were just not working for New Orleans. The area where New Orleans is now situated was once formerly ruled by both Spain and France, and each of these countries buried their dead above ground. So the graveyards of New Orleans took style inspiration from these countries and introduced the above-ground tombs. The first cemetery in New Orleans that was designed for the above-ground tombs was the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. Seeing as this is New Orleans' oldest graveyard, at the time there was no planning, which makes the layout extremely disorganized. This creates almost a confusing maze of tombs that twist and turn in weird ways that can make you lost when you're walking through the cemetery. The graveyard is also surrounded by a wall of communal oven crypts, basically creating a wall of death that holds everyone else and their tombs inside the city of the dead. During my tour of the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, which is only accessible as part of a tour, by the way, this is due to the city shutting down public access to the cemetery because it was a haven for thieves and drug dealers and just general crime. Plus, the ancient tombs were just a magnet for vandals, so the city had to do something about it. It is a shame, but with a guide, you get to learn so much more about the history of the cemetery and its famous residents, so can't complain. As I walked through the cemetery, passing by each brick tombstone, crumbling under the heat of the sun, I learned all about the ominous-sounding Oven Crypts. An Oven Crypt is exactly what it sounds like. It's an above-ground burial chamber, which is made of brick, complete with the arched brick ceiling, and it's similar to brick ovens used for baking bread. These ovens, however, are not used for baking delicious treats. In New Orleans, corpses that have not been embalmed are placed inside wooden caskets and stored in these oven crypts. Each chamber holds one coffin at a time, and a lot of the time these tombs are owned by one family and shared through generations. So how it works is one family member is destined to live within the confines of the crypt walls, slowly cremating under the hot subtropical New Orleans sun. The corpses are allowed to stay for precisely 1 year and 1 day. These oven crypts are reusable, and you share it with your family for all of eternity. So why 1 year and 1 day? Well, the heat in New Orleans causes the body to rapidly decompose within a year. The inside of these crypts can reach a staggering 350 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 177 degrees in Celsius. And this extreme heat turns the corpse into ashes and leaves a desecrated skeleton. It's also believed that after this amount of time, any diseases that person had were no longer a threat to the living. The extra day was given for respect, as it was seen as disrespectful to disturb the remains on the anniversary of their funeral. So what if there's no family member that has died within the year and the day? The person that's in the crypt will just stay there until the next person is ready to be buried. So, the crypt would be opened, and the remains would be removed from the coffin. The coffin was then destroyed by a fire, or nowadays it's just tossed in the garbage. And I am not kidding. Apparently it's fairly common to see coffins just sticking out of piles of garbage at the landfills in New Orleans. I have not seen this, so I can't confirm, but if you're from New Orleans, let me know if that's true. The remains of the body would stay behind in the crypt, but be pushed or swept back into a chute called a caveau. The bones would fall into the chamber below, meeting up with the remains of previous family members that now lay there, forever mingling with everyone else's ashes and bones. If you've ever heard the phrase, "I wouldn't touch him with a 10-foot pole," well, that comes from New Orleans and the act of pushing the remains, with a pole, into the back of a crypt. Communal oven crypts, or walls of oven crypts called society tombs, were created by communities to provide a place where each person, regardless of family or status, would be allowed the same burial practices as others. If you walk among the cemetery and see walls covered in 3 to 4 crypts stacked on top of one another, these are the communal oven crypts. Everything is the same except for the plaque on the front of the crypt is changed out with each new body. So the remains are pushed back into the caveau to linger among others, but where they lay may be a mystery to anyone who isn't aware of the spot they were buried, as the plaque only remains for a year. Another reason people love to tour the cemeteries in New Orleans is to visit the tombs of New Orleans' famous dead residents. For the St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, people visit the graveyard to see tombs of people like Marie Laveau and Nicolas Cage. Now, Nicolas Cage is still alive, but as you walk among the old tombs filled with Greek Revival architecture like obelisks and pyramid tombs, you will spot a 9-foot-tall, giant white pyramid with the words Omnia ab uno. When you see it, you may think you have stumbled upon some sort of strange, out-of-place tomb, and you have. But it is the future resting place of everyone's favorite actor, Nicolas Cage. There's a really strange story behind Nicolas Cage and his weird and dark connections with New Orleans. And I actually did an entire podcast about him. Be sure to listen to episode 2, and you will hear all about his unusual ties to the city. So for some reason, a lot of people have taken to the tradition of kissing his tomb. They leave lipstick-covered lip marks all over the pyramid, and I have no idea why. I assume after he actually does die, that'll probably get worse. Another really famous cemetery resident is the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, Marie Laveau. Her tomb, however, is surrounded by a bit of controversy. There's a dispute about where she's actually buried within the cemetery. People argue that there are 3 separate crypts within the cemetery that could be her final resting place. And some people even say that she wasn't buried in the cemetery at all. The story behind Marie Laveau's life is a little bit confusing. So I will get into her story in a future podcast, but for now, I'll tell you that she was a highly respected but also highly feared voodoo practitioner in early New Orleans. There's a bit of confusion about whether or not she is immortal. After her death, she seemed to continue living and practicing voodoo. So was she actually dead or immortal or what? A lot of others say that her daughter just took over her role after she died. And she even called herself Marie Laveau, which kind of feeds into this confusion of where she was buried when she died and so on. Whatever happened, she was highly praised, and she made a huge impact on the city of New Orleans. Due to her power, her legacy has continued long after her death, and people still visit her grave in an attempt to have their wishes granted. They say that if you mark her tomb with 3 little X's and leave a small gift, your wish may be granted. If your wish does come true, you're supposed to return to the tomb exactly 1 year later and circle your original 3 X's. This lets other people know that your wish came true, it worked, her powers are still working for everyone. Of course, this is vandalism and you shouldn't do it. But judging by how many X's are marked all over the tombs that are suspected to be hers, people don't seem to care and the tradition lives on. Walking within the cemetery, the air seems to be way hotter than the rest of New Orleans. I don't know why it's so much hotter in these graveyards than everywhere else, but maybe it's because you're essentially surrounded by ovens that contain temperatures hot enough to cook a turkey. And the heat from these ovens cascades around the cemetery, making it sort of the land of impenetrable heat. With New Orleans being a city that runs on superstitions, my tour guide advised me to cross the threshold backwards to prevent evil spirits from following me as I left the cemetery. As I walked backwards through the gates, leaving the boiling hot but stunningly beautiful St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, I bolted for a shady area where I could cool down before finding more dark history to explore in New Orleans. And that's it. Thank you for listening to Everything Spooky in the Dark, the podcast for WanderingCrystal.com. Be sure to check out the blog for more information about the dark history behind New Orleans.